Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the Israeli combat Black Hawk, the AH-60M. Now before we kick things off, I do in fact have a video on the American Black Hawk and also on helicopters in general and how to use them in the game of War Thunder, so if you are interested for more, please feel free to check those out as well. Kicking it off with the flight performance of the AH-60, if you're not familiar with the Black Hawk is a moderately fast and agile platform, especially when it's not carrying a lot of internal cargo. However, one of the biggest weaknesses of the Black Hawk platform, and one thing that you will notice with this aircraft specifically, is that it puts a lot of the weight far out to the left and right side of the vehicle on the wing pylons, especially if you're carrying a lot of ordnance. This means that if you're doing sudden shifts to the left or right to dodge anti-aircraft or planes, you might experience some difficulty in recovering if you hold it a little bit too long. All that being said, even though it is a transport heli, it is definitely a lot more agile than something like a Mi-8. So if I were to put its flight performance characteristics on a scale of the least fun to fly helicopters like the Mi-8 and the most fun to fly helicopters like the AH-6, this definitely leans a lot closer to the AH-6. As far as the overall durability of the AH-60, it's not the best but not the worst I've ever encountered. You do have a decent amount of empty space that can be used to absorb shots, especially poorly aimed ones, and the airframe itself is reasonably sound, although you don't have a ton of protection for the pilot and co-pilot from larger caliber cannons and missiles. With that being said, you do get the normal suite of laser warning, radar warning, and missile warning systems, and the radar warning is the particularly good one where it tells you the type of radar and rough distance, so you can tell if that radar ping is either a Su-27, a Pantsir, or even a friendly F-15. It does also come with an infrared countermeasure system, which is supposed to delay or defeat the detection of infrared missiles. However, I have noticed anecdotally that the American IRCMs don't work anywhere near as efficiently as the Russian ones, so on the whole, I don't think you should really count on the system saving you from heat-seeking missiles. Of course, I imagine most people when they pick up a helicopter are looking far more at the weapon systems than anything else, so let's get into that. The AH-60 does feature some fairly good quality thermal optics so you can easily identify targets, and on top of that it also has an auto tracker, and you should definitely check my helicopter guide if you're not familiar with how an auto tracker works, because it is very important, especially when you're targeting your gun on aircraft or if you're trying to target things like Hellfire missiles. That obviously brings us to one of the biggest changes between the AH-60 and the American Black Hawk, and that is the 20mm cannon. Now this 20mm cannon is basically ripped off of the French Gazelle helicopter, reasonably high velocity, pretty good damage, at least against air targets. Against ground targets the penetration is somewhat underwhelming. With that being said, you can combine it with the auto tracker to effectively bullfight aircraft who are trying to charge you, and this does put this miles ahead of the American Black Hawk in terms of its ability to protect itself from other aircraft. Both planes flying at you and helicopters that get a little too close can pretty easily be taken out with this cannon, which is hands down one of my favorite improvements this has over the American Black Hawk. That being said, it's not exactly a perfect addition. If you're used to the range of motion that the Apache has for its 30mm cannon, you will notice the gimbal mount on the AH-60 is a lot more limited. It doesn't go up or down or to the sides anywhere near as much, but still covers enough of the frontal arc that you can comfortably take out most aircraft with relative ease, so while it is limited, it's not actually that bad. As far as the unguided Hydra rockets you can equip, I'm not really going to spend too much time on this because honestly this is basically the starting helicopter weapon for most nations, and most people are pretty familiar with them by now, but the long story short is that you can carry a lot of them. They can kill anything in the game with a good enough hit, and if you want to helicopter rush, they are certainly a weapon that is viable to do so, although they are pretty unspectacular in this role. This does bring up the point that if you are somebody who likes to early helicopter rush, the AH-60 is noticeably worse than the Apaches that you have available, because the AH-60 just doesn't have as much power in the gun, and the Apache's gun is actually quite effective. Another weapon we're not going to spend too much time discussing are the Hellfires. The Hellfires are a reasonably powerful but also somewhat inconsistent missile because they go up and then drop down on the target, and this leads to them being somewhat difficult to target against things that are moving or things that have any kind of cover between you and them, such as foliage or smoke. That being said, they can kill anything in the game with a good hit to the roof, so they're not unusable by any means, but they do have a fairly long flight time, and the inconsistency in targeting can be a little frustrating, especially because you have to keep your aircraft pointed at the enemy the entire flight time. You do get the ability to carry a total of 4 Hellfires stock, so you at least don't have to grind out all of its weapons using nothing but rocket pods, which is a really good addition, and I do appreciate they have added this to the game, even if Hellfires and only having 4 of them can be a little wonky, especially at this battle rating. Another weapon that we're not going to spend a ton of time on are the Gators. Now, the Gators are essentially a laser-guided Hydra rocket, and anecdotally, I did actually get the opportunity to pick an Apache pilot's brain on exactly how good they thought they were in real life, and he said they were actually kind of annoying because they didn't fuse correctly if you were firing them at longer ranges. It's not relevant to the game, but it is an interesting side note. In-game, the only real application they have is hitting light vehicles and anti-air because they use a flatter trajectory and tend to hit the target earlier than a Hellfire would at the same distance. However, they don't track initially, they have to build up some speed, so they can be a little awkward to aim, and as soon as you get access to the spiky Rs, they're basically useless because everything you can kill with a Gator, you can also kill with a spike, and the spawn cost difference is fairly negligible. Before we get on to the star of the show, we also briefly have to cover the Stinger missiles. The AH-60 can carry up to 8 of them once you've researched them, and Stinger missiles, while not the most consistent weapons in the game, can be at least somewhat useful, although they can struggle to hit aircraft moving at high speeds, and they often struggle to lock onto helicopters, but they're not completely useless, they're just somewhat inconsistent and not great, and it's really nice the AH-60 has the backup gun for when they feel like not behaving. Of course, the star of the show with the AH-60 are going to be the spiky Rs, of which you can carry up to 16 of these missiles. The spiky Rs are a fire and forget missile that locks onto infrared signatures, and you can technically lock onto the infrared signature of anything that has an IR signature. This is both ground targets and air targets. The spiky R does have 2 notable drawbacks. Number 1 is its relatively low speed, which also gives it a very high travel time, and this gives a lot of opportunity for enemies to either break line of sight, pop smoke, or just get destroyed by one of your allies before they finally arrive. They also have another drawback in that because they are a fire and forget missile, you can't specifically target them at certain weak points, so once you fire them, you have no real control over where or how they hit the specific enemy in question. Anecdotally, I found the targets that the spiky Rs are the best at taking out are usually things like light tanks and anti-aircraft vehicles, as it usually doesn't really matter where you hit these vehicles with a spike, it will usually take them out, and a lot of the anti-aircraft systems don't even have access to smoke, so even if they see the launch, there's often not much they can do about it. The ERs are also fairly good at taking out helicopters because a lot of helicopters don't have the best ability to evade them. However, the long travel time can make it a slightly annoying prospect, and it's often hard to tell exactly if the spiky R will eventually connect with a helicopter or not. Against main battle tanks, the spiky Rs are very inconsistent, although they can definitely one-hit kill anything. In this respect, because you can carry so many of them, I do often find it's not that bad of an idea to either fire one individual each at a large group of tanks, or if you see a single tank that you really want to knock out, fire one and then wait a few seconds to fire a second missile to try and guarantee that kill. That being said, this still isn't really a sure thing that you will actually take out the tank because they could hit things like barrels, tracks, or even roof-mounted machine guns and do basically no damage. The spiky Rs can also technically track and hit planes, although realistically the plane would either have to be moving directly towards you or incredibly slowly for this to be a viable tactic, so unless somebody's in a rank 1 biplane hunting after you, it's probably not going to work out all that well. On the whole, I found the spiky Rs had about the same cross-section of problems that you have with a Hellfire, except once you fire the spiky Rs, you can drop behind cover, you don't have to keep your laser on the target the entire time, and by itself this generally made them a lot more useful than Hellfires, although there were quite a few situations where the spiky R just couldn't find an infrared signature, even though I could clearly see the enemy, and had I had a Hellfire I would have easily been able to take out that target. You could mix and match the missiles, although that can get a little tedious to manage. On the whole, I would say the AH-60 is quite good and is currently my preferred helicopter to take out with Israel's top tier ground forces, but this does bring up an interesting problem. Israel doesn't have any light vehicles or any hypermobile vehicles that can go into position quickly to try and get an air spawn, so I did find that it was actually kind of annoying to get enough spawn points quickly enough to spawn this helicopter in time for it to do something. It wasn't impossible by any stretch of the imagination, but compared to a tech tree like USA or even China, it was noticeably more annoying to try and reliably get in the AH-60 to get footage for this video. This does bring up an interesting point about the Israeli helicopter tree in general, because unless you have the Merkava Mark IID, the Israeli ground forces jump straight from 9.3 to 11.0, and this limits the usefulness of a lot of the helicopters in the tech tree, specifically when you start talking the various Cobras. The Lahatut I actually found better than the Zephyr B because the Lahatut has toe 2s and is a lot more agile, whereas the Zephyr B's engine really struggles. Then you have the Zephyr DF that only really works if you have the Merkava 2D for it to fly in the same lineup with, and the Peten and the Saraf are both at the exact same battle rating as the AH-60 and in my opinion noticeably worse. In that respect, you could mostly just stick with the branch of the Israeli helicopters that uses the Lahatut and the AH-60, and in my opinion you're not really missing much right now, unless you have the Merkava 2D, in which case it might be worth it to get the Zephyr D. This does bring up a small side note in that the Saraf is actually rated for the spiky Rs, so in theory it should get them at some point, although who really knows when that's going to happen, and when/if that does happen, it will be better than the AH-60, so it's only temporary, but at this point the left hand side of the Israeli helicopter tech tree does feel a little redundant on a lot of levels. And that concludes our video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, that always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.